and welcome to segment 6 of Field Training for Law Enforcement. In this particular segment, we're going to be discussing the learning climate. In segment 7, we're going to be discussing remedial training strategies. But before anybody can hope to implement some effective training strategies, the learning climate must first be established, the environment in which learning is going to take place. Let's begin with our goal in the FTO program. This statement: it is not our goal to produce the fully experienced officer, but rather the fully trained one. And what we evaluate in this program is his or her response to the training. Let's keep that in mind as we talk through the learning climate in this particular segment, and in our next segment, remedial training strategies. I've said before that one certainly of the most critical aspects in the selection of the field training officer is his or her interpersonal skills. It's important that they be able to communicate and be effective in their communications. On the other hand, or in addition to that, they have to understand some of the laws or principles that we know exist when we're trying to establish the learning climate. In other words, learning is actually a skill that we hope will be developed within our trainee. But we have to understand some of these principles that we know are in place in order to help that trainee learn. So let me run through that list for you. The very first of the laws of learning is the law of motivation. In other words, if somebody is to learn, they have to feel some motivation, some strong needs, some strong emphasis or impetus on their part to learn. If people are not motivated to learn, they certainly won't learn. Our role, again, is to create the kind of environment in which they want to learn, in which they feel the need to learn, in which they're motivated. A second law or rule or principle is the law of reward, also called the law of effect. The FTO's role, again, is to create the learning environment in such a way where the trainee feels there is some reward to learning. Too often, behavior such as hazing or harassment is seen on the part of an FTO to where the trainee's learning experience proves out to be a painful one, to where they're teased, they're kidded, they're held up to ridicule. So we need to avoid that kind of behavior and keep in mind that we need to set it up so that the trainee will experience some reward, some positive reinforcement and feedback when in fact they do learn. The next of our theories or principles on the laws of learning is the law of readiness, or SET as it's called, the law of SET. This is particularly important when we're trying to help the individual grow through a particular process or learn a particular skill. The FTO needs to take into account the environmental factors that might be there. The end of the day, for instance, is a very poor time to attempt to introduce a totally new subject. Fatigue may have set in already. It is difficult for the trainee to psychologically and physiologically focus on the training that's being presented by the FTO. So trainees need to be ready. One of the ways that the FTOs will help trainees be ready is, of course, to provide the resources, the time, the opportunity that is so necessary in order for learning to take place, in order for the trainee to prepare or to be ready or set to learn whatever this new strategy might be. The next law is a very important one. It's called the law of meaningfulness. The law of meaningfulness suggests that people will not learn things, particularly adult learners, will not learn things if they don't see any meaningfulness to the task, if they don't understand why it's important to learn this particular thing. Again, too often perhaps trainers, because they are so skilled and they are so experienced, take it for granted that somebody else might understand why you might be teaching a particular subject or trying to review a particular aspect of behavior. We need to remember to pause and introduce, if you will, introduce the subject or introduce the task, and to point out why it's so important for the trainee to be able to do this particular thing, whatever it may be. That's the law of meaningfulness. Our next law is the law of association. People learn best if they can somehow or another associate this new task, the task that's being introduced, with something that's already learned. A good example might be report writing. If we're going to introduce, for instance, the accomplishment or how to complete a burglary report, assuming that the trainee has already performed adequately some reports in the past. A good way to introduce this new burglary report writing scheme is to refer back to some aspects of report writing that have already been successfully accomplished by the trainee. In that way, he can associate this new task with something he's already learned, which will enhance his understanding as well as diminish any fear or negative expectations he might have about his ability to succeed with this new task. The law of simplicity is one, in fact, we've already touched on when we talked about how to develop the recruit training guide or the weekly task list. We talked about how we want to format the information in there so that it is developed from the simple to the complex. Anytime that we can introduce information in its simplest form, we are then able to build on it as we move towards the complex aspects of the task. Picture, if you will, an attempt to teach somebody how to load and unload a shotgun by going through the entire scenario of mechanical movements that are incorporated within the shotgun, as well as the nomenclature of all the parts that represent a shotgun. Any training officer that would approach training from that perspective will find that the trainee is still back at the starting point, where the FTO perhaps mentioned the name of the receiver or perhaps the safety or the trigger guard, because the trainee is still back there in terms of his mind. Any further instruction on the part of the FTO is frankly wasted time. So a simple approach is to do things simply, piece by piece by piece, a so-called incremental approach, and in that way people will learn. And then finally, a very, very important one of the laws of learning is the law of feedback. Feedback is critical to success. If the trainee receives no feedback, whether it's positive or negative, he has no idea of, one, his or her success, or two, his or her failure. We're going to be talking a great deal about feedback in other aspects of this presentation as well as in the next segment, but feedback is something that is inherent in good training, inherent in the learning process. Okay. So here we have now, we've got a set of laws that if we in fact follow those laws, and we'll be able to accomplish or certainly have a higher expectation of accomplishing learning, which is our job is to help the trainee learn. It's much like motivation. So let's shift gears a little bit and take a look at motivation. And before I begin, I'm sure that you've all heard the phrase, we really need to motivate this guy or gal. This person needs some motivation. Well, let's start off with the premise and understanding the premise that you can't motivate me and I can't motivate you. The only person that you or I can motivate is ourselves. Now, our role as trainers, of course, is to keep this path clear of barriers and obstacles that the trainee intends to go down towards success. The trainee comes to us motivated. They come out of the academy, and for the most part, they're eager, although there's some apprehension, but they're eager to take on this new job. They've got all pumped up in the academy. They're ready to go. And so they come to us already churning in terms of this self-actualizing activity that's going on within that we call motivation. They want to move down the path. Our role, again, is to keep that path clear of all those roadblocks and barriers that are going to interfere with their moving down this path towards what they hope is the achievement, successful completion of our training program. Frederick Herzberg, and let me point out his name because I know it's difficult for some people to follow. Frederick Herzberg is considered very much the father of a lot of common or today's motivational theory. Frederick Herzberg, in a very simplistic sort of way, identified what is motivation. Motivation is the desirability of rewards and the expectation of success. In other words, if I desire a reward, first of all, that suggests that I am motivated towards reaching that particular goal. On the other hand, if there's no expectation of success, I'm turned off, and it's unlikely that I'm going to make any further movement towards that goal. Let me give you a very quick example from my own experience. When I was a good deal younger, I was a fair to middle baseball player, and I had an intense desire to play baseball for what was then the Brooklyn Dodgers. A desirability of reward. I began to participate in baseball in high school and American Legion ball, and I just didn't turn out to be much of a ball player. One day I recognized that, And that was the end of my motivation or my drive towards being a baseball player for the Brooklyn and then, by then, the Los Angeles Dodgers. I had the desire, but there was no expectation of success based on the feedback that I received from my coaches and from my team players. I realized that I really was not competent enough to reach this goal. That stopped my desire. Now, let's take a look at our trainees. The trainees come to us, they have this desire for the reward. The reward or the goal that they're achieving is to be successful in the FTO program, to clear probation, and to become a tenured member of our organization. If we don't communicate to them that there is an expectation or a likelihood of their success, then we're going to impede or set that barrier along this road that they choose to travel. So in this particular area, we become the operational or the operative person in terms of the motivational aspects that the trainee brings to the job. Keep this in mind. They come highly motivated. The expectation of success is often in our lap. It's often our role or the role that we play that would bring this about. So Herzberg's motivational theory, and to go back to our law of motivation, when we talk about motivation then, keeping in mind that people will not learn if they're not motivated to learn, we need to pause again and just take a look or a further look at Herzberg's theory. His theory has been called the motivation hygiene theory. A lot of us, I think, have been conditioned to believe that, for instance, money is a motivator. Herzberg pointed out that money is not a motivator. It's a mover. It moves people. Once the money is gone, people stop moving. Motivated people continue to move, regardless of such things as good supervision, good working conditions, new cars, money, things of this nature. Those are described by Herzberg as movers. Let me give for you for a moment a list of those things that Herzberg describes as the motivators. The first motivator is achievement, or a sense of achievement. Here you can see, again, hopefully, the FTO's role in the introduction of this or the enhancement of this particular motivator. Giving the trainee an opportunity to achieve is one of the principal jobs of the FTO. Going back to the laws of learning, if you keep it simple, if you make it meaningful, if in fact you consider are they ready to learn and so forth, they likely will achieve. So our role here is to remove any barriers that might exist as they move towards the goal of achievement. A second motivator that Herzberg identified was recognition for task achievement, to provide recognition to the individual when in fact they have made they have experienced some successes. I want to point out, sometimes we wait for somebody to reach the top of the mountain before we acknowledge their success. An effective field training officer will reward or recognize successes each step along the way as they are climbing towards the mountain. And that's really critical in terms of your feedback system and your interpersonal skills. Become a positive reinforcer. As people begin to achieve, as people begin to move towards a goal, that's the time to provide recognition, positive recognition to them for their efforts and for those short-term successes, those small successes that they're experiencing. Another positive motivator in terms of Herzberg's theory is responsibility. When people say, no, wait a minute, I don't want more work, I want less work. A lot of people say that, but people are turned on when they are learning and when they're in a learning process, when we hand them additional responsibility based on previous successes. Think of the turn-on that a young officer might have who is in a training program on the day that the FTO might turn to him or her and say, you know, you've been doing so well and I've been doing all the driving. How'd you like to take the wheel? Now, there might even be some apprehension there, but they're really turned on because here's another aspect of the job that heretofore has been performed only by a real police officer. They're being allowed now to take the wheel, which is a further proof to them that, in fact, they are moving towards their goal of also being a real police officer. So additional responsibility added at an appropriate time is a very, very effective motivator. Two other motivators are opportunities for growth and advancement. Opportunities for growth and advancement are also very powerful. Opportunities for growth in our terms are the feedback, again, the additional opportunities to learn new things, feedback from the FTO that they are progressing very well, and the goal is now perhaps in sight. Advancement to the position of clearing probation and becoming a tenured officer. And then finally, not to be overlooked, Herzberg also identified that in some occupational fields, the work itself is a very positive motivator, that people are turned on by what they're doing. Now, again, to reiterate, my purpose in pointing this out is that the FTO is the external source of, has the external power, I should say, to remove barriers that might impede somebody's ability to move towards a sense of achievement. The FTO is the one that provides a recognition. The FTO is the one that awards additional responsibility, provides those opportunities for growth and advancement, and of course often is turned on by the job. And so that being turned on by the job that they're doing, job of a police officer, a corrections officer, or what have you, comes across to the trainee, gee, this is something I want to do too. This guy is turned on, he's doing a great job, he's happy in his work, he's comfortable in the organization. So you can see how the FTO's role here, utilizing some of these principles of Herzberg's principles and the principles that we know exist within motivation, are very, very powerful tools, and how they enhance that learning climate, the environment in which learning will take place. Okay. There's somewhat of a subtle thing that's going on here too, and that is the message that the FTO sends to the trainee in terms of the expectations that the FTO has for the trainee. Some of you may have heard this phrase, the Pygmalion effect, and if you haven't heard the Pygmalion effect, I'm sure that you've heard the phrase self-fulfilling prophecy. We know from the studies of, numerous studies, I should say, that have been conducted with people based on the expectations of trainers, the expectation of parents, the expectation of teachers, of bosses, of supervisors, that high expectations on the part of the teacher, of the parent, and so forth, usually yield high results. Low expectations will likely yield low results. So I want to encourage you to keep that in mind. If you send the message to the trainee that you have high expectations for their success, then it is more likely that it will be successful than if you, in fact, send a message of concerning low expectations for success. Okay. Now, the last thing that I want to touch on today as we're talking about creating the learning climate is behavior modification. And it may well be that you're going to go, behavior modification, what's that? Behavior modification and training are synonymous. If you think about it, the purpose in training is to change behavior from what is to what we'd like to have it be. And so it's a modification, if you will, of behavior. There are certain things we need to understand about behavior. Again, the FTO being the external force. When people do something right, and they are rewarded for that, it is likely they will repeat that behavior. In fact, that's one of the two foundational principles for behavior modification. As human beings, we attend to, and as human beings, we are likely to repeat those things for which we are rewarded. As human beings, we are likely to avoid the things for which we're punished. So here you are again. You're the external force. You're the deliverer of punishment, or you're the deliverer of reward as an FTO. Now, to make it clear, reward isn't necessarily money, and it isn't necessarily medals and so on. A reward can be a smile, it can be a pat on the back, it can be a good score on the daily observation report, whatever the case may be. Punishment, on the other hand, doesn't have to be bloody. It can be a frown, it can be a poor score on the daily observation report, it can be a verbal chastisement, it can be a negative comment in the narrative section of your documentation. But again, the FTO is the external deliverer of reward and punishment. And let me repeat, as human beings, we tend to repeat the things for which we are rewarded. We tend to avoid the things for which we're punished. All right, so here you are, the FTO. You can reward or punish. Now, these are important tools that you have available to you. Another thing to keep in mind is as we behave as human beings, something happens. Every time I do something, something happens. The impact or the quality or the intensity of what happens will direct my future behavior. So if I do something well and I get a very positive feedback from that, a reward from an external source, it could be an FTO, it could be from the community, it could just be the achievement of a project, the accomplishment of building something. I get a reward from this external source. I'm turned on. The more intense that reward, the more likely it is that I'm going to do that thing again. So if I go to a restaurant and have a really great meal, I'm likely to go back there. On the other hand, if I have a really bad meal, it's very unlikely that I will go back there. Okay, so here we see that the intensity of what happens to us when we do something, whether it be a reward, which is something that I view as something happens that I like, or whether it be a punishment, which is defined as something happens that I don't like, that's going to direct my future behavior. All right. Your role as the training officer is to introduce reward and punishment. Again, keeping in mind it doesn't have to be dramatic. Now, it may be dramatic if a trainee goes out and we've had certainly one example, a trainee fooling around with a weapon, is very careless with a weapon. After being warned several times not to do that, that's going to be a big punishment. It's likely to result in a recommendation for termination. On the other hand, the first time that they might be careless with a weapon, the feedback would be a relatively minor punishment, an admonishment from the FTO that says, you know, that's very careless, don't do that again, let me show you how you should have managed that weapon. So keep it in mind as we go through this, reward and punishment are your tools. The degree of the behavior would very likely result or dictate the degree of response in terms of reward punishment. Final thing, with tools, you have to know how to use them. And there are three methods or ways of using reward and punishment that must be followed. The first one, the reward or the punishment must be relevant to the behavior. In other words, the punishment must fit the crime. You've all heard that phrase. If it's a little mistake, we give a little punishment. A big mistake, big punishment. Some small thing well done, a little reward. A great heroic kind of behavior is a big reward. So the behavior or the response, if you will, punishment and reward must fit the crime. Second point, it must be applied consistently. If this yields a reward today, then it ought to yield a reward tomorrow. If this equals a punishment today, it ought to equal a punishment tomorrow. And thirdly, lastly, but most importantly, the reward or punishment must be immediate. You can't wait a week, a month, a year to give feedback to the trainee about how well they did or the mistake that they made. Okay, as I said, in our next section, we're going to be talking about remedial training strategies. But as we go through those the next time, please keep in mind the importance of establishing that learning climate. If the climate isn't conducive to learning, no matter how hard we try to remediate these problems and performance failures that we say, it's going to be an impossible task. Thanks for your time. See you again. Segment 7 of our field training and evaluation program presentations is dealing with, or is going to deal with, remedial training strategies. And I think if you reflect on some of the information that we conveyed in Segment 6, you'll see how it's so important for us to integrate the remedial training strategies with that training or learning climate that we've already created. And it's important that I say at the get-go here that while we have talked extensively about the evaluation process in some of the earlier segments, it's very important that we maintain a balance between training and evaluation in this particular program. A total training approach without evaluation will not yield the desired result. In other words, we won't have a sense of how well that training is taking place. On the other hand, evaluation only without training is frightening, it's abusive even, and certainly it doesn't serve our needs, because we are focusing, if you remember, on the production of somebody that is fully trained. And I guess that might lead me then to reasons why people do fail. To be very frank with you, seldom do people fail because of their inability to learn technical skills or their inability to digest and regurgitate knowledge and information that we convey. Most of the time, people fail because of things that are either in the environment or attitudes that they may bring to the job. And let me say, it's been my experience that the biggest reason that people fail is because of the absence of a positive self-image, to where their confidence level is not such that they will succeed. They see themselves as failures. You've all heard the phrase, you've never heard a winner talk like a loser. And when we talk about self-image and the lack of positive self-image and confidence, remember back to what we talked about, and that was the FTO's role in enhancing the self-image by reinforcement, by providing opportunities for success and achievement, and utilizing some of those laws of learning that were discussed before. Some other reasons for people failing is that when they are treated unfairly, this may be their perception or it may be reality. People will fail as a result of being uncomfortable or through discomfort, through illness, through fatigue. A lack of understanding, perhaps, of what it is that they should be doing and how it is that they should do. There are some people that just perhaps cannot grasp the picture. We also see people fail when, in fact, personality conflicts exist between them and their FTO. And I might say at this point that if, in fact, a personality conflict is perceived by the FTO or reported by the trainee, it's imperative that we rotate that trainee immediately to a new training officer in order to offset that claim and perhaps satisfy ourselves as to who really has the personality problem. People also fail because of worry and anxiety that they may have. Again, I think you can see the relationship to worry and anxiety and the positive self-image. And then, of course, we see failures because somebody really at this particular point in time lacks maturity, is immature, lacks worldliness, and consequently, we can't really get the totality of the picture of the job. Does not mean that down the road they may be successful officers, but at this point in time in their lives, it's really not the job for them. Okay, another point that I'd like to make, because it offsets perhaps perceptions that training officers and program managers have, and that has to do with this program being what I might call a terminal performance objective. Terminal performance objective. In other words, what we're looking at here is their performance at the end of the program. Let me go to the board for a moment, and if I may, let's assume that this line represents a 14-week program. This particular line represents acceptable level of performance, or 4-level performance as we know it to be. Now, when we take an experienced officer, we see progression much like this. It is very likely that experienced officers will be, and in fact it is the case, the experienced officers are far more likely to be successful in the field training and evaluation program than somebody who is inexperienced. So if we've had occasion as training officers to work with experienced officers before from perhaps another agency or another state, we can form the perception that this is how people should be progressing in the program. Inexperienced people may progress something like this. That might be the learning curve of an inexperienced officer or candidate. Another learning curve might be like that. Another's learning curve might be like that. So each of us learn in a slightly different way and at a slightly different speed. The point I want to make here is, if we begin to make judgments relative to their success at this point along our 14 weeks, it is likely we might write these people off. And remember what we've talked about, high expectations yielding high results, low expectations yielding low results. So our focus is, where are they, or should be, where are they at the end of the program, not necessarily where are they in here. We certainly have to introduce some remedial strategies all along the way with all 4 of these examples here. But your mindset as an FTO has to be based on, let's remediate this, let's continue to work, let's continue to utilize those motivational strategies that we talked about, and don't start writing these people off in here. Again, we all learn at different rates, and the learning curve is important. Don't also be seduced by what you may have seen having worked with a trainee who has prior experience. Okay, so what are some of those remedial strategies that we can use? There are some relatively simple devices that are used not only in the FTO program but throughout education. And the first is the flashcard. Flashcards are great devices to teach people things like the 10 codes or radio codes, to quickly teach certain critical elements of certain crimes, to teach something such as policies. You might have the policy number on one side and an explanation of the policy on the other. And a tip for you is have the trainee make the flashcards. Don't prepare them for the trainee, because there's a certain amount of learning and a certain amount of retention that will be enhanced when they, in fact, make the flashcards. So flashcards, great device, cheap. Certainly the price of a package of 25 or 50 3x5 cards is pretty inexpensive. Another approach you might use, and one that's dandy for spelling, is quizzes. A good device to teach spelling is, of course, as we all learned how to spell, is repetition. So we might ask the trainee to go home and write several words that we've identified as being misspelled over and over. Ask him or her to go home and write those 25 or so times. Now, I like to offer opportunities to learn rather than make assignments. So my strategy would be to say to the trainee, you know, I'm going to give you a quiz this coming Friday. Now, if you're concerned with your spelling and you'd like to improve your spelling, here's something you can do. I'm not assigning this, but I'm making this offer to this person. Here's something you can do. You can take this list I have here, take it home, write each of these words 25, 50 times, and I'll assure you that you'll do better on this quiz that I'm going to give you this coming Friday. We can give written quizzes, we can give verbal quizzes. Certainly quizzing, surprisingly enough, is too often overlooked by FTOs. Another strategy, excellent to teach driving and to teach observation skills, is commentary driving. Commentary driving teaches both observation skills and orientation. So you can use it in several different ways. You can ask the trainee for a period not to exceed perhaps 10 minutes or so to relate to you as they move through the community, which direction they're going, have them identify landmarks along the way. As they make turns, have them indicate the streets or the roads that they're traveling on. That's commentary driving. Commentary observation, or commentary driving to develop observation skills, is have them relate to you what they see and ask them to draw some relationship from what they see to perhaps a police or law enforcement related situation. Commentary driving, excellent for teaching orientation, excellent for teaching observation skills. Another device, and one that we often use when we're trying to teach procedures or trying to teach ways of resolving instances that don't often happen, such as perhaps a homicide investigation. This procedure, a simulation. We will simulate a crime scene. We'll simulate a homicide, and we'll take the trainee through it as though it's a real event. I know we do simulations in the academy, but again, we always have a problem with retention from the academy experience. So we want to make this as real life as possible, and events, as I say, that don't often happen in the trainee's experience. A great way for us to develop some sort of a feel as to their skills in this area would be through the use of a simulation. Role-playing, to where the FTO would play a particular role and have the trainee interview the FTO as though he were interviewing the victim of a crime, or have the trainee contact the FTO as though the FTO is a motorist that's been stopped. Excellent device, as well as reverse role plays. Reverse role plays is where you ask the trainee, who perhaps has just made some mistakes in a street contact or in interviewing a victim of a sexual assault. we ask the trainee, okay, why don't you take on the role of the female here that you just interviewed, and I'll interview you, now acting the role as a female, in the way that you just interviewed her, and see what kind of feeling you get for the job that I do, representing the job that you did. So role plays and reverse role plays. Of course, reading assignments, great device, making reading assignments, homework assignments, assigning people scanners, for instance, who are having trouble developing the radio ear. You may want to provide a scanner to them to take home. Give them the assignment to listen to that scanner for a half hour each of the next 3 nights to see if they can't help that radio ear. And one other point I want to make, when we make assignments, homework assignments, there was a concern perhaps that the Fair Labor Standards Act says that you have to pay these people overtime. No, you do not. The one provision, or exclusion, I should say, in the Fair Labor Standards Act for paying overtime is when people are in a training mode. So because these people are in a training situation or experience, you can make homework assignments and have them work beyond their 40-hour work week when, in fact, it's training related. So don't be concerned about having to pay some extra money to somebody because you've made these homework assignments. Okay. We go back to, if you recall in an earlier segment, when I talked about the 12 or 14 or 16-week experience in the FTO program, there are times when we may have to hold somebody over in the program or extend their stay in that field training and evaluation program. When that happens, we need to be able to come up with some real remedial strategies. The purpose of extending somebody, again, is to fix things that we, in fact, believe that we can fix. Attitudinal issues such as immaturity, absence of self-esteem, and so forth, those things are very difficult to fix. But there are some other things that we can fix. So we use our extension period, again, to introduce our remedial strategies. And I might remind you that we're stopping the clock during the course of the FTO program when we have chosen to extend somebody. So if you can picture somebody being in the 6th week of the program, and the clock is ticking through the first 6 weeks, at this point when we make the decision to extend them for remedial purposes, we're going to stop that clock. And we're going to develop whatever remedial strategies that we may have, and then consequently after those strategies are over, and after, in fact, we hope that they have been successful and they're back up to speed, that's when we're going to start that clock again. Now, an extension usually calls for something I might describe as a rather heroic remedial effort, something where we'll unplug somebody, as I say, from the program, maybe reassign them to the day watch so that they can have more opportunity with report writing, maybe reassign them to a particular FTO who is really skilled in report writing, or very skilled in making car stops, or very skilled in providing feedback. And when we do that, we want to be sure that we've got the documentation in the file that discloses and displays what it was that we did to bring about this change. There is a form that I've yet to identify to you, and it's one that you'll find in your resource material. It's called the FTO Worksheet. The FTO Worksheet is a 2-part form. The first part of it is filled out by the FTO, and it begins with him or her identifying the problem in as specific set of terms as we can, identifying what in fact has been tried to date to remediate the problem, and then in great detail identifying what it is that we have set forth as our game plan to bring about a change. The FTO worksheet is often developed in conjunction with a supervisor and or other FTOs, is frequently developed as a result of conversation that takes place at one of our biweekly evaluation sessions or one of those periodic meetings that we discussed. That's part one. Part one then identifies the problem, what we've done about it, what we plan to do about it, and of course, the bottom line to that is such things as the performance goal that we expect, the date and time when we expect to have it accomplished, any resources that are necessary for task accomplishment. It's, in other words, a very detailed lesson plan without following the traditional lesson plan format. Part two of the FTO worksheet is completed following the effective date or the hoped for effective date of the completion of our training plan. And in that form, Again, I refer you to the material that's in your resource packet. On that form, you'll see where the FTO describes the problem again, identifies what was done, and reports back on how effective it was, how effective the plan was, and also decides whether or not we have to develop another plan or we can move on to other things because this was effective. This is critical documentation that we expect to have placed in the trainee's file, along, of course, with other documentation that should be there all along, dealing with what the FTO has done to remediate the problems. Feedback. Again, we go back to the interpersonal skills, so important for an FTO to have. But feedback is extremely important to bring about change. Now, at the end of the day, at the end of your training experience on a daily basis with a trainee, every FTO will have the opportunity and should take the opportunity to provide constructive feedback to the trainee about what happened on that day. So the scenario, a suggested scenario, would look something like this. At the end of the day, having completed the daily observation report, I would sit down with my trainee, give the trainee a clear opportunity to read the information. I would then begin to ask some very probing kinds of questions, not questions that call for yes or no answers. The question like, do you understand this? That's going to probably elicit a yes. So your question might be, what is there about this that you don't understand? Or what don't you understand? What do you understand when I speak about the car stop that was made? The problem that you had when searching a prisoner at intake, the difficulty you had while working the fireboard, whatever the case may be. So I want to ask some very telling questions. That's the first approach. We give them an opportunity to look at it, and we find out what it is that they understand or don't understand. The next question should be, what is it that you agree with or don't agree with? Let's talk about that. Let's see if not only is understanding there, but how comfortable are you with this information that I've conveyed on this form. The next thing to do, and the most positive thing to do, is to lay out the game plan for tomorrow. And you can just picture this. The first example might be an FTO that walks up to the trainee, hands the trainee the daily report and says, okay, read it over, turn it in, see you tomorrow. As opposed to the FTO that sits down, gives the trainee an opportunity to read it, asks these questions, and then says something like, okay, here's what we're going to do tomorrow. We had some problems positioning the patrol car when making those car stops, so we're going to practice. We'll go over to the local grocery store parking lot, and we'll practice positioning the patrol vehicle on some of those cars that are parked over there. Or I'm going to pull out some report forms, some practice report forms that I've got in my briefcase, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to practice report writing using those forms. Now, we talked about avoiding predicting, so don't say things like, and I think with a little more work you'll have it down pat. Don't say that. But if you clearly identify what it is that you're going to do, what it is the trainee's going to do, and what success will look like specifically, then that's good feedback, and there'll be a game plan for tomorrow. In the first example, where the FTO hands it to the rookie and walks out of the room, put yourself in that trainee's place. You know, how forward are you looking to tomorrow and coming back to work when you just looked at your report card and you find it's filled with F's? On the other hand, when you see that there were some problems today, and you've had an opportunity to address them, and the FTO is giving you good feedback, and then there's a game plan for tomorrow, I suggest to you that the trainee is much more likely to be enthusiastic about coming back to work tomorrow, because tomorrow we're going to work on this problem, and his or her expectation is that we're going to resolve the problem. Okay, the final thing that I want to talk to you about in terms of remedial strategies, also relative to feedback, is the use of three very, very powerful words. I call them interpersonal pronouns. Interpersonal pronouns. And the first of these is the word I. I want you to use the word I very often. I. How? Make it clear to the trainee who it is that appreciates the job they're doing. Make it clear to the trainee who is disturbed or upset about the job that was done. Make it clear to the trainee whose job and role it is to see that they succeed, to direct their activities and so forth. Picture the trainee, let's say in an organization as large as Detroit or Los Angeles or San Francisco, where the FTO says, you know, the chief would really be upset if he read this report. That trainee's never even seen the chief. That has no impact on him. What the trainee wants to know is, what do you think about this report? So don't bail out on your responsibility. Use this word, make it clear to the trainee who it is that cares, who it is that wants change, and who it is that's in charge. Number one. The second of these three words, powerful interpersonal pronouns, is this word we. Use we a lot. We're going to make it. Don't worry, we'll keep working on this. If you put all the responsibility for learning in the trainee's lap, he's going to feel as though he's alone. But when you talk in terms of a team approach, you and I, we, then there's a subtle but a very real understanding on the part of the trainee that he or she is not all alone, that the whole burden is not on them. So we're going to make it. And if we keep plugging away, we will be successful. So use this word a lot. The reason these words are so powerful is because they are internalized. They are not only heard, but they're felt. And it can't be any truer for the use of this last word, and that's you. Be very, very particular on how you use this word you when you're both criticizing and when you're complimenting. Let me describe this to you. If I look at my trainee, and I'm reviewing a trainee's report, and I turn to that trainee, and I've got to say this report isn't very good. If I turn to that trainee and I say, you know, you wrote a bad report here, that's an attack, if you will, on that trainee's report writing skills, but it's an attack on that person personally. That word is internalized. If I want the report corrected, I ought to attack the report. So a better approach would be say, this report is poorly written, and if you watch somebody's eyes when you're giving them feedback, when you're saying you did something, watch where their eyes are. If you say something like the car stop, they'll reflect on that car stop that took place an hour or so ago. Same thing with the report. You say the report was poorly written, that opens the door to, okay, what's wrong with it? And now we can move on and identify what the problems are. This word you is a very powerful word in terms of positive and negative use. When we use it to attack the person, you fouled up, you made a mistake, immediately the defenses go up and we know what happens, flight or fright. But nothing really gets done in terms of what it is we want changed. The upside of it is, because again it's internalized, is using this word whenever they do something right. You did a heck of a job. I'm so proud of what you did. You know, we're really seeing some progress here. It's because of the effort that you put forth. Those, again, are powerful, powerful things. Does that puff people up? Does that enhance the self-image? Is that one of those motivators, recognition? And how about the sense of achievement? It's all there. So good luck to you in your remedial strategies. By no means did we talk on all the possible ones that exist out there, but I'm sure with your creativity and your solicitation of input from the other members of your team, you're going to come up with all those possible or all those positive kinds of ways of resolving these problems. See you next time.